A warm greeting to everyone, and welcome to a new lecture on self-knowledge. We are going to continue with our series of lectures from Phase A. Today, we will talk about lecture number 14, Drugs and Alcoholism. This lecture is a very important one because it will teach us how we can study these two psychological defects within our own psychology, work on them, and in this way be able to help other people overcome this problem. Or, if we ourselves are facing this problem, if we are slaves to one of these vices and are under their control and want to break free, then through this lecture we will learn about the different tools or techniques to be able to work on this psychological defect. So let's begin by talking about the objectives of this lecture. The first objective is to show the urgency of eliminating these two psychological defects, egos or details of the mind, since they make any progress in inner work impossible. It is important that from the very moment we begin our inner work, the work on the three factors of the revolution of consciousness, we are completely radical with these two defects, because if we are not, we will have problems in our inner progress. We will not be able to advance. We will not be able to see results in this work. That is why it is urgent we understand and apply what we have learned. We must practice what we are going to learn in this lecture. Only with true discipline will we be able to free ourselves and help those people who are possessed by this psychological defect, who are enslaved by these psychological defects or ways of being. Many of you will say, well, I don't have a problem with alcoholism. Others will say, yes, I do have it. But there are people who say, no, I don't have that problem. I'm not an addict. But surely you do know many people around you who have this problem. We will have the chance to help someone affected by these defects. These tools give us wisdom to help. Only if we manage to understand these defects of alcoholism and drug addiction within ourselves will we be able to help others. That is why it is important for us to study and deeply understand them. So, let's begin by talking about alcohol. Is alcohol a malevolent force? Alcohol is considered to be one of the most powerful demons that exist on planet Earth, known for its remarkable strength and the fear it inspires in those who are aware of its presence. Why are we talking about a demon? We talk about a demon in particular because at this moment there is what is known as the White Lodge and the Black Lodge. When we talk about the White Lodge, we are referring to all the masters who seek the intimate self-realization of their being and who help others to also achieve self-realization. The masters of the White Lodge are currently fighting so that human beings work on the three factors of the revolution of consciousness, awaken their consciousness, and unite with their being. Just as the White Lodge exists, so does the Black Lodge. The Black Lodge, in fact, actively seeks for as many people as possible to enter involution, fall into the abyss, and lose all possibility of being or of achieving self-realization. These two lodges, the white and the black, always confront each other at the dawn of any creation. At this moment, on our planet Earth, it is no exception. These two lodges are present. So when we talk about demons, we are referring to beings who belong to the Black Lodge and who seek to lead as many people as possible into the abyss. At this moment, human beings are ruled by numerous demons who hold power over humanity and seek to make people lose all possibility of self-realization or of working on themselves. We see, for example, that there are demons or black magicians, in other words, who try to make people waste their time chasing after money and materialism. There is, for example, a demon that imposes work days of 8, 10, even 14 or 15 hours a day, so that people have no time for self-realization or to work on the three factors of the revolution of consciousness. Other demons seek to make people waste their time on leisure, video games, television, or series. So they waste energy on trivial things, which stops them from self-reflection and conscious self-improvement. But there is one that is much more powerful. We could say it is the most powerful of all at this moment, or at least one of the most influential, alcohol. Alcohol seeks to plunge humanity into drugs and alcohol. For what purpose? This corrupts their vital energy and blocks inner work so they cannot transform, awaken consciousness, or achieve higher creation linked to their being or spiritual purpose. Alcohol corrupts humanity. This demon is represented with the head of Medusa, which was cut off by Perseus. If you remember this story, you know that Perseus bravely faced Medusa. Medusa was a terrifying demon that no one could confront, because anyone who looked at her directly would turn to stone. That's why no one could ever face her. However, Perseus carefully came up with a brilliant method to confront Medusa. Perseus did not look at her directly. He used his shield to observe Medusa's reflection, and in this way he was able to cut off her head. This Medusa represents the defect of drugs and alcohol, which we should not confront directly. We must look at it through the mirror or the shield of the past and work on all the psychological defects or aspects that manifest from this defect in order to eliminate it. We will delve further into this as we continue with this lecture. So let's talk about what the mottos of Algol are. There are 9. What are these mottos? Well, Algol is the ruler of that planet, right? It is everywhere. Almost all human beings consume alcohol to a greater or lesser extent. You can go absolutely anywhere on the planet, in any country or region, and you'll find alcohol there. You can travel to the most remote, hidden, and isolated places on the planet, and there you'll find alcohol. There you'll find some kind of fermented beverage. Therefore, we'll find alcohol everywhere on the planet, in every corner. But it is not the master of the planet just because it is present everywhere and because all human beings consume it, but also because of the high level of acceptance it has. Nowadays, most people not only consume alcohol, but also consider it something normal, right? It is something socially accepted and even defended. Today, a person who drinks alcohol is no longer seen the way they used to be, when they were viewed as someone doing something negative, right? On the contrary, a person who drinks alcohol is proud of it, and when, for example, they tell their friends, they do so with pride. I drank so much, I was drinking until such and such time. So for most of society, drinking alcohol has become a source of pride and something considered acceptable. It's closely associated with sharing, with fitting in with others, with feeling better, with being more relaxed, and therefore its level of acceptance is extremely high, which is why it's found everywhere, in so many different contexts. Let's take a closer look at how the consumption of alcohol can lead people to reach high levels of error in judgment, or even to commit a great number of serious mistakes, and in this way, how it ultimately brings them to experience misfortune, hardship, and deep misery in their lives, right? If you connect all the conflicts within families, if you link all the traffic accidents to alcohol, you'll find that most of these tragedies that happen in daily life are related to alcohol. Most traffic accidents, most fights between people, arguments and conflicts, even within families, are closely related to alcohol. Therefore, it is leading society toward misfortune and degeneration. In addition to that, alcohol has a characteristic. It inhibits the personality. When it inhibits the personality, when the personality is inhibited, that important barrier, which normally prevents human beings from making certain kinds of mistakes, is effectively removed. Our personality, at the very least, holds us back in certain situations so that we don't make mistakes. But when we consume alcohol, that protective barrier weakens. It is simply no longer present. As a result, all of our psychological defects and flaws can manifest freely, without any kind of filter, restraint, or inhibition. The person ends up greatly feeding lust and anger. That is why they may eventually end up hitting someone or causing a tragedy, hurting, or even killing another person. This happens because they are not fully aware of what they are doing. Their defects take control of the body, and there is nothing left to stop them. These are some of the slogans of this demon, Algol, through which it drags society toward degeneration, disgrace, and misery. When the personality is inhibited, it also causes the person to make great mistakes, to reach high states of sexual excitation, to great states of violence, and what happens is that the person degenerates rapidly. This means that it essentially lubricates the wheel of samsara, that is, it makes the cycle of deaths and births within the wheel of samsara spin increasingly faster and faster, and the person loses their opportunities for self-realization. There are also some characteristics of this demon, and the characteristics of this demon are, in particular, that it is very subtle and also very diplomatic indeed. What this means is that this demon knows how to get in or infiltrate, so to speak, into all areas of society, reaching every corner and aspect of people's lives. For example, if a person is going to give a speech, they might drink alcohol in order to be able to give the speech more calmly and confidently, so they won't be nervous or anxious. If someone is heartbroken because they've been hurt, betrayed, or they're feeling bad emotionally, then they drink alcohol to try to feel better, even if only for a little while. But if, on the contrary, the person is feeling good and is celebrating an occasion, like a graduation, a wedding, or even the birth of a baby, they also turn to alcohol to celebrate. So alcohol is present both in moments of sadness and in moments of joy. In almost every family gathering, it's almost always there. For example, wine to share with the whole family or beer to share with close friends. So alcohol will always be there accompanying gatherings with friends or family get-togethers. But if it's a work meeting, we'll also find alcohol as a usual companion. For example, such as, or perhaps a whiskey during a negotiation might seem very appropriate. All of this allows this demon to infiltrate all kinds of circumstances and moments. We always perceive it as something positive, as something appropriate, something that goes well with moments of interaction with others. And this is one of its main characteristics, the subtlety with which it quietly enters and infiltrates our lives. And in this way, we don't perceive that it could cause us any harm. However, let's be clear. Yes, there is harm, and yes, there are consequences associated with this demon called alcohol, and it's worth analyzing it seriously, beyond the consequences you already know and that you've probably heard about your whole life. In addition to the physical consequences it can have on health, and besides the psychological consequences, such as the burning of neurons or the deterioration of a person's vitality, there are other consequences that you probably don't know about, which are related to spiritual work and inner development. Now we are talking about the consequences for the awakening of consciousness. This defect directly attacks any possibility of being. This defect prevents a person from achieving self-realization, from awakening their consciousness, because it directly affects the three factors of the revolution of consciousness. This defect undermines sacrifice for humanity, psychological death, and spiritual birth. And we are going to talk about how it ends up damaging the work a person wants to do on themselves. Let's start with psychological death. If a person consumes alcohol, they revive dead egos. What does this really mean? What this means is that if you have already learned the technique of psychological death and want to eliminate psychological defects, you must keep in mind that if you consume alcohol, even in very small amounts, even just a single drop of alcohol, even just one glass of wine, that is already reviving the dead egos, meaning the egos that you have managed to eliminate through psychological death will come back to life when you consume any amount of alcohol. Regarding spiritual birth, it corrupts the creative sexual energy. What does this mean? It means that this contaminated energy will not be able to be transmuted, it will not be able to be used for higher creations, it will not be able to ascend, and it will end up descending into the atomic hells. That contaminated energy will not allow us to carry out any kind of creation. Therefore, a person would not be able to practice spiritual birth or suprasexuality if they consume even the smallest amount of alcohol. And in the same way, it takes away our strength for inner work and prevents any real possibility of being. These are the consequences that are truly worth studying, beyond all those you may have heard in the media or within society itself. The consequences that truly matter to us here are the consequences for the work on the three factors. And what we can say with absolute certainty is that this defect, even in the smallest proportion, is preventing any possibility of being. With this in mind, let's now talk about some warnings we need to consider when working with this defect called alcohol. The first warning is that this defect must be addressed in a radical way. And when we say in a radical way, we mean that it must be forever, with no turning back. When I decide to quit alcohol because I want to work on myself, because I desire self-fulfillment, I cannot start making deals with this defect. It's not about quitting gradually. It's not saying, I won't buy it anymore, but if offered, I'll have some. Or I'll only drink on weekends. Or I'll cut back. If I used to drink this many beers, now half. No. Working on this defect requires a firm, definitive decision. Those kinds of deals are useless. When we decide to quit this defect, we must leave it behind radically, completely. We are not going to consume even a single drop of alcohol again, and we will never drink alcohol again. That is what it means to be radical with a psychological defect, and it is the only true way to confront it. Any deal or concession we make with this defect will always lead us to lose. Sooner or later, the defect will betray us because it is deeply treacherous. And the most dangerous thing is that many times it seems to hide, especially when we begin to acquire this knowledge and work on ourselves. We start to let go of this psychological effect, and it feels like we've already eliminated it, that is already gone. But no, the persistent defect is still very much alive, and it patiently waits for any moment of weakness to attack us and make us fall once again. That's why it's really important for us to work on it in a radical way. Now, let's talk about the second aspect of this lecture, which is drugs. Drugs as a category present an even greater and more significant level of difficulty than alcohol, primarily because they tend to create a much more intense and powerful dependency. And why is the level of dependency higher with drugs? Because the momentary pleasure that drugs produce is undeniably greater than that of alcohol. If a person feels comfortable consuming alcohol because it allows them to socialize with family or friends, or because they feel it helps them unwind, de-stress, or reduce their nervousness, then with drugs, those sensations are experienced at an even more intense level, right? They feel a more noticeable pleasure. Yes? It's a momentary pleasure, but much more intense, and that significantly increases the level of dependence on the substance. The greater that instant pleasure a person experiences, which in some cases can feel as if it equals hundreds or even thousands of orgasms, the greater the dependence they will develop on whatever substance they are using. That's why drugs end up being much harder to deal with than alcohol, because of that level of dependence. After that momentary pleasure, pain always follows, suffering always comes. And the more intense that momentary pleasure is, the more intense the emptiness, pain, and suffering will be, that you inevitably feel after using. And therefore, in the attempt to escape from that suffering and that inner emptiness, dependence, and the need to use again begin to gradually develop. Now let's take a moment to talk about how we can deal with the effects of drugs. The first thing we need to understand is the historical origin, how it arose and how this defect began to gain strength on our planet. Because this defect is very old. The phenomenon of drugs has existed for a very long time. However, there was a moment in history when its influence intensified significantly. At one time, the psychological defect of drugs became stronger than in previous eras. And this happened thanks to something known as the Dionysian wave. Let's talk a little about this topic. Around the 1950s, a judgment was carried out against humanity. In that judgment, it was determined that humanity should perish. In other words, this planet was already highly degenerate. The human race had fallen into deep decadence, and too many mistakes had been made. Therefore, it was concluded that humanity should disappear. However, there were some masters who interceded for us, asking that we be given another chance, that we be granted more time, the necessary time so that we could have greater opportunities for self-realization. Thanks to their intervention, humanity was granted an extension. All of this took place in the context of that judgment known as the Judgment of the Nations. At that moment, it was decided in the tribunal that a wave called the Dionysian wave would be generated, which would reach planet Earth. This wave, upon coming into contact with human beings, would produce two types of reactions. If this wave impacted a person who had a true spiritual longing, that longing would intensify, as would their ability to work on themselves. But on the other hand, if the wave reached someone who tended toward degeneration, then that negative impulse would also intensify, further accelerating their process of degeneration. When this wave collided with the inhabitants of planet Earth, the majority of those who sought degeneration, who sought to devolve, increased their level of degeneration. And it was then that a wave of debauchery emerged, especially linked to sexual degeneration. The rise of rock and roll took place, accompanied by movements characterized by sexual promiscuity, hippie culture, and the famous slogan of the era, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The so-called women's liberation also occurred, which in many cases led to forms of radical feminism. All of this began to manifest during that time, and it was then that this demon called alcohol started to gain a lot of strength, both through the consumption of alcoholic beverages and the use of drugs. Drugs began to gain tremendous influence during that era, and it has continued that way, becoming more and more prevalent up to the present day. Now, if we polarize ourselves negatively with this wave, because this particular wave is still very much active, we will deteriorate and degenerate much more quickly. But if we polarize ourselves positively with the Dionysian wave, on the contrary, we will have a greater longing, increased strength, and more merit to be able to advance in our inner work and spiritual development. If we want to wisely take advantage of this Dionysian wave that continues to reach our planet Earth, then what we should do is work on the three factors of the revolution of consciousness, seek the awakening of consciousness, and we will gain great benefits and progress in our inner work. But, on the contrary, if a person wishes to degenerate, they will do so at an accelerated pace. And unfortunately, that is what is currently happening with the majority of people on our planet Earth. And that is why this issue of alcohol and drugs is becoming so widespread and will continue to gain momentum. The consequences of drugs are the same as those of alcohol. It also revives dead egos, corrupts the creative sexual energy, and prevents any possibility of reaching the being. However, it has even deeper and more serious consequences than those associated with alcohol. One of the particular consequences of drug use, in addition to the effects it shares with alcohol, is that it opens doors to lower dimensions. As we mentioned in conference number 9, there is a door through which our psychological defects enter. This is located in the lower abdomen, in the area corresponding to the instinctive center. So when we consume alcohol, that door opens, allowing the entry of defects with a higher voltage. This means that generally we are used to enduring a certain level of influences or psychological defects. But when that door opens, the defects enter with much higher voltage. In other words, it is not simply the ordinary anger we usually experience, but a much more intense form of anger with voltage higher than what we are normally able to withstand. When a defect of that voltage enters, the body, being unaccustomed to withstanding it, reacts like a light bulb exposed to a voltage higher than it can handle. It burns out. In the same way, the physical body suffers damage, and when that psychological defect finally leaves the body, it takes with it a large portion of vitality, leaving the organism greatly degraded and weakened. And that is why the person deteriorates so quickly, not only physically, but also in terms of their vitality, precisely because of this process. Another consequence of drug use is that it annihilates the alpha rays, which are the vibrational frequency responsible for allowing a person to concentrate. The person will not be able to concentrate, and that is why someone who has given into drugs cannot focus. They start talking about one thing and end up talking about something else because they cannot organize their thoughts or maintain the same line of thinking since those alpha rays are burned out. Drug use also seriously damages our sexual system. The person not only revives dead egos and corrupts their creative energy, but their sexual system also suffers deep harm. This can lead to impotence, premature ejaculation, and even to having children with malformations, since the seed is also affected. Therefore, the consequences are much deeper and affect different levels of being. Not only is the physical body compromised, but also the vital body, the astral, the mental, and even the causal body. The very essence itself is impacted by the intense consequences generated by drug use overall. How should these two defects actually be eliminated? This is the most important part of this lecture. How are we going to work on these two defects? Well, in order to work on these two defects, the first thing a person has to consider, or the first thing they need to know, is that this work is done voluntarily, that no one is going to force us to do this work. The person must have the willingness to change, must have the desire to change. No one can force us to self-realize. No one can force us to eliminate a psychological defect. This process must be carried out voluntarily. It is necessary to have a genuine longing for change, to recognize that there is a problem, and to want to get out of that condition. If a person does not want to leave that state, there is no human power, not even a divine one, that can do it, because the gods do not violate free will. It is the person, through their own will and free choice, who must make the decision to eliminate that defect, to unite with their being, and to achieve self-realization. That is the most important thing. Once the person develops that longing, they will begin to apply certain tools or techniques, which we will discuss later. The first step is self-observation, to start observing their own psychology and to understand how that psychological defect operates within them. When a person observes themselves, what do they observe? They observe their mind, their emotions, their instinct, and also their physical body, specifically the motor center itself. What is it that you are going to observe in your own psychology? It is important for us to observe the three traitors. Let us observe Judas, which is desire. Let us observe Pilate, which are the justifications. Let us look, for example, at Caiaphas, who represents bad will. If a person is working on the defect of alcohol, the first thing they will observe is desire. Suppose they enter a supermarket and come across the liquor section. Upon seeing it, a desire immediately arises within them, the desire to buy or consume alcohol. This desire manifests in the emotional zone, specifically in the instinctive center, located just below the navel. The person observes that desire and must deny themselves that desire. My mother, eliminate this defect from me, and they deny themselves that desire. However, when the desire is denied, justifications from the mind may start to appear. Then the mind begins to say, oh, but it's just a little bit. Ah, no, this is the last time. I'm only going to drink today, but starting tomorrow I won't drink again. Or if, for example, we are with a friend, then the psychological defect will tell us, no, it's just to share with my friend. It's been a long time since I've seen him, so I need to spend time with him. The mind starts giving us countless justifications to fall into error. But the mind doesn't just present us with positive justifications, meaning those that push us toward pleasure or desire. It also generates negative justifications. In these cases, the mind tells us things like, I can't, I'm not capable of eliminating this defect, this is too much for me, or this defect is too powerful, I can't face it. These kinds of justifications also appear at those moments with the purpose of making us convince ourselves that we are not capable of eliminating the defect, and thus we end up surrendering to it. Any of these justifications, whether it is the justification that leads us toward pleasure or the justification that is based on pain, must be eliminated. We must not accept any kind of justification because none of the things the mind tells us are correct. It is all a lie. If the thought appears, this is the last time, no sir. Divine Mother, eliminate this defect for me. If it says, but I can't, no, that's not true. My consciousness can do anything. Divine Mother, and my ego. We must understand something. And that is that in order to work on drugs, we must awaken, in a conscious way, the inner man. The inner man is, in essence, our own conscious awareness. The inner man is fundamentally our very being. The outer man is the one who believes he is weak, thinks he can't do it, and finds it difficult to face his psychological defects. In contrast, the inner man knows he can face them. Consciousness can confront any defect, including drugs, as well as others that may seem even harder to eliminate. The defect of drugs is, in reality, just one more defect. When a person understands this, they realize that within themselves lives a warrior, their consciousness. It is that consciousness, that inner being, who has the power to eliminate it. The person will begin a process of communication with their being through practice, conscious experimentation, and inner nothingness, which means recognizing they have a psychological defect and must eliminate it. By initiating this communication with their being, they will awaken the necessary strength to face that defect. In this way, they will begin to self-observe, identify that desire, and deny it. At that moment, they can mentally express, my Divine Mother, eliminate this defect from me. The person notices their internal justifications and faces them individually, aiming to eliminate them. During this, they can mentally say, Divine Mother, remove this justification, and they resist impulses. I do not get swayed by that justification. I do not get convinced by the mind. and they will also face their own ill will. Ill will is in reality the underlying defect, the persistent flaw that is always trying to take control of our human machine. It is the defect wanting to rule our machine and steer it for its own benefit, to move it toward its own advantage. When we observe ill will, we realize that we are already acting under its influence. We are already buying the bottle of alcohol, accepting it, or in the case of drugs, preparing the cigarette to smoke. At that moment, our physical body is already moving in the service of the psychological defect. If the person self-observes carefully, they will recognize that ill will is present there. The will not to give in to that psychological defect takes control away from it over the human machine. This machine belongs to my being, to my consciousness, and I am not going to hand over control to the defect. Instead, I make a conscious sacrifice. I refuse to obey the defect. I do not do what it wants to do. In fact, I do the opposite. I use my time and energy on something more conscious, for example, on a practice aimed at awakening consciousness. In this way, one begins to overcome this psychological defect, whether it is the defect of drugs or the defect of alcohol. In summary, the steps are self-observation of both the desire, the mind, and the ill will, discovering and recognizing the psychological defect, realizing that it is wrong, that it is a defect, and then eliminating it by asking the Divine Mother, "My Mother, eliminate this defect from me." What other recommendations do we have, in particular, for working on this defect of alcohol or this defect of drugs? We need to leave the circle of friends in which we find ourselves. That is, if we are alcoholics, surely all our friends are alcoholics. If we are drug addicts, surely all our friends or a large part of our friends are drug addicts. We need to distance ourselves from those people so that they do not tempt us to relapse, so that they do not generate that force that makes us fall or descend. And we have to start interacting with people who are seeking to awaken their consciousness. That will help us a lot. We can also go out in the mornings. Once we are leaving this defect behind, we should go out in the mornings, preferably at dawn, to sublimate if we don't have a partner, right? If we have a partner, we can begin to transmute our energies and start the process of sexual transmutation. And if we don't have one, we can sublimate every morning and practice the dervish exercises to detoxify the body, cleanse the liver, and start eliminating all the contamination we've accumulated because of these defects. It's also possible to make deals with the law, that is, to negotiate with the divine law so that it helps us eliminate these defects, so that it locks them away. For example, if a person has a defect related to drugs or alcohol that they have fed for a long time, and they feel that this psychological defect is very strong, they can make a deal with the law. They can ask the divine law, through the practice we learned in the previous lecture, the practice of the business of the cross, to please lock up that psychological defect, in order to be able to work on it more effectively and thoroughly. So what the divine law will do is lock up the defect, leaving only a small part of it so that we can start working on it. As we gain strength, they gradually release more of the defect so that we can work on it more easily. The divine law helps us a great deal in this process. We ask for the defect to be locked up, and in exchange, we commit to working on the 3 factors of the revolution of consciousness, so that they will help us by confining that psychological defect. We can also engage in activities of sacrifice for humanity to overcome idleness. Idleness is a great friend of drugs and alcohol. Whenever a person is unoccupied with nothing to do, these defects attack with greater force. But if the person stays busy, if the person starts gaining experience, begins to become an instructor, engages in acts of sacrifice for humanity, and connects with others who are also awakening, if they keep themselves occupied, if they look for ways to stay busy, to fill themselves with responsibilities toward consciousness, then it will be easier for them to face this defect, because that sacrifice for humanity will give them a great deal of strength to be able to eliminate the defect. Let's take a moment to reflect and meditate. The idea here is to dedicate at least 1 full hour each day to carefully studying and observing the psychological defect we are currently working on, whether it's alcohol, drugs, or any other harmful habit or behavior. We are going to start reflecting on how this defect has harmed us, how it has affected our physical body, how it has damaged our sexual apparatus, how it has distanced us from our being, and how it has taken away the strength we need for inner work. We are going to carefully look at all of the harm that this particular defect has caused in our lives, as well as in our ongoing inner work, We will begin to review the scenes in which this defect manifested in order to eliminate everything we felt in those moments. The desires, the sensations, the thoughts, the memories, and all the details related to that defect in each of those lived experiences without exception. It is important to meditate on this defect every day until we manage to eliminate it completely. It is worth emphasizing that this defect can be eliminated. It is not as difficult a defect to eliminate as our mind makes us believe. In fact, this is one of the defects that can be eliminated the fastest. The defect of drugs or alcohol can be perfectly eliminated in 1 or 2 months, or at most 3 or 4 months, completely. If the person works seriously, if the person works every day meditating, every day confronting that defect, they will be able to eliminate it in a few months. In fact, there are defects that are much more difficult to eliminate or that will require us much more time. The mind makes us believe that eliminating it is difficult, but that's not the case. This is a defect that, if we correctly apply the techniques we have just learned in this lecture, we will be able to eliminate. In this way, we can make progress in our inner work. That was today's lecture. Thank you very much to everyone who joined us. We will end with this phrase: we must act in life according to the fundamental principles that we carry deep within our being. Our being is the one who will guide us and accompany us on this path towards self-realization and the elimination of those defects. Thank you very much.